The skies above Caridin Prime were violet with the stormfronts of war. Plasma trails rippled like falling stars as dropships roared into the troposphere. The surface was a shattered wasteland of obsidian crust, cratered and burned from the orbital fire of the Aelari Imperium's fleet. Inside Command Spire 9, set upon a fractured plateau overlooking the northern hemisphere, High Castellan Threx of the 3rd Aelari Expeditionary Legion narrowed his eyes. His mandible tendrils twitched in distaste as another feed flickered on the hololith, a forward unit overrun by primitive bipedals who fought like maddened beasts. These creatures lacked genetic cohesion. No hierarchy, no central control cortex, no regenerative tissue. They bleed and they fall. Across the chamber, Strategos Hellman, his neural lattice gleaming with biochrome, folded his arms. Yet they fight with irrational persistence. They fight after we incinerate their leaders. They fight when we take their limbs. Threx hissed, "Flesh, that's all they are, diseased, erratic flesh. This campaign should have been concluded in one orbital cycle. Instead, we've lost 14 tactical enclaves in the past 9 rotations." 18, Hellman corrected grimly. Their species, the Aelari, had conquered 500 worlds through calculated dominance, using doctrines refined over millennia. Each engagement was a war of ratios, troop logistics, strategic surrender vectors, psychological collapse models. Their conquests were inevitable because they were predictable. But the humans were not. Across the scarred world of Caridin Prime, human units were resisting even after orbital infrastructure was atomized. Caves became bunkers, cities became tomb complexes of ambush and crossfire, and soldiers stopped responding to expected trauma triggers. One name kept surfacing through intercepted comms and decrypted surface relays. Corporal Adrian Rivaz. Not a commander, not a general, not genetically enhanced, merely a line infantryman from a fractured Terran nation. And he refused to die. Rivaz limped through the blackened ruins of Stratos 11, the carbon bones of towers clawing the sky around him. His left arm was torn at the shoulder, a crude pressure clamp salvaged from a drone casing sealing what remained. Shrapnel lined the left side of his face like silver tattoos. His leg was a mess of splints and scavenged armor plating. He had no medevac beacon, no functioning comms array, and no squad left. But he carried the war. He had turned the central energy conduit into a fire corridor, melting through an Aelari incursion team with redirected reactor heat. He had mined their hover tanks with the magnetic cores of ruined hard drives. He had moved like a ghost across the battleground, too injured to sprint but never stationary. His mind ran calculations not taught in any academy, instinctive, brutal, desperate strategies that turned every failure into fuel. He saw the sky light again, plasma rays descending in perfect synchronization. Another bombardment. Rivaz ducked into the remnants of a cargo hauler, heart pounding. He gritted his teeth as pain lanced through his torso. Pain meant something different to him now. It wasn't a signal to stop. It was a reminder that he still had things to do. Aboard the Aelari dreadnought Crescent of Judgment, new footage played before the War Council. "Observe," Threx commanded. The chamber dimmed. A black and white thermal recording played, a lone human dragging an injured comrade through fire, weaving through Aelari patrols. 2 drones intercepted them. The human rose with a broken length of steel and impaled the first drone, then used its falling body as cover to fire the last of his ammunition into the second. Threx turned to his officers. "Explain how he still moves. His leg is ruined. His neural stress should have induced cardiac failure. By every model we possess, he should be dead." "Unknown," replied the biostrategist Vanner. "Preliminary scans suggest incomplete pain inhibition and overwhelming survival drive. The neural activity is," he paused, recalibrating, "chaotic, improvised, functioning far outside any known combat threshold." "Improvised," Threx said the word like it was filth. "They adapt faster than we can analyze. Their weakness is supposed to be their lack of cohesion, but this one turns chaos into a weapon." They watched the recording again. Hellman leaned forward. "They called him Rivaz. This one human has compromised 9 resource nodes and eliminated 4 strike teams. He uses debris as weapons, plasma from downed ships as traps. He has no command unit, no order structure. He fights because he chooses to." Threx's tendrils stilled. "That is the difference," he said. "No one chooses to fight the Imperium. They obey orders or they break if these humans choose." "Then we are not fighting a species," Vanner whispered. "We are fighting a belief." Beneath Caridin's fractured equator, the resistance huddled in geothermal tunnels. Rivaz limped into the glow of makeshift lamps, greeted by silence and stares. Half a dozen wounded soldiers nodded at him, some missing limbs, others eyes. "Still breathing," he said through blood-cracked lips. "You shouldn't be," said a medic. "No one should." He collapsed against the wall, sliding down into a crouch. "But we're here." Captain Salen, the senior survivor in this quadrant, crossed the chamber with shaking hands. "They say you dragged Corporal Jane through 3 kilometers of enemy patrols with one arm." Ravaz nodded. "She's alive." "Why, what the hell are we doing here, Adrian? There's no evac, no fleet, command's gone, this war over." Ravaz looked up slowly. His eyes were dull but focused, like coals beneath ash. "No, it's different now. They think we're done. They think flesh breaks and doesn't stand again. Let them keep thinking it." "What are you talking about?" "I'm not trying to win this war," he said. "I'm trying to make them afraid of it." He stood, grunting as his body resisted. He picked up a piece of piping and began wrapping it with torn polymer cord. "Because if they start to fear humans like they fear entropy, like they fear the void, then we've already broken them." From orbit, Carradine looked dead, but beneath the scorched crust, a war continued in silence and fire. And the Aelari commanders, for the first time in an age, began to question whether the tide of empire could be turned not by greater force, but by the will of the broken who refused to fall. The Aelari began shifting their doctrine. They deployed neurosensors to capture emotional residue from battlefields, attempting to quantify the unquantifiable. They rerouted 3 legions from the Cadran front just to suppress Carradine Prime. For the first time in Imperium history, the War Council authorized unrestricted field experimentation. They wanted to understand the human aberration, not destroy it. What they didn't realize was that Adrian Ravaz had become more than a man. He had become a contagion of resistance. The tunnels beneath Carradine festered with pain and adaptation. Ravaz, his wounds sealed not by medicine but by will and rudimentary stitching, had begun crafting new forms of warfare. No factories, no supply chains, just scavenged tech and obsession. He trained the wounded not in conventional tactics but in survival ambush, hit and vanish, strike and vanish again. He taught them to move with silence, to use the enemy's own scanning patterns against them, to leave no heat signature. They hunted with knives and broken drone optics lashed to makeshift rifles. They mapped Aelari movement by watching the birds flee. They began calling themselves Ashborn. Not a rank, not a unit, just the name of those who refused to die properly. Aelari Command Spire 4, Eastern Hemisphere. Strategos Hellman paced before the latest kill analytics. Ravaz has multiplied. There are now over 100 engagements attributed to the Ashborn. They strike without broadcast signals. They jam our tactical readings with debris storms. They've destroyed 4 Gravlev trains and deconstructed our long-range comms tower using acid from native fungus. Threx tapped his claws on the control plinth. "We brought full orbital superiority, an Imperium siege armada. Why are we still discussing a primitive infantryman and a rabble of cripples?" Hellman stopped pacing. "Because they are winning, not on the map, not in territory, but here." He touched his temple. "In the minds of our troops, they fear the humans. They hear stories of shadows pulling officers into vents, of broken ones smiling as they crawl through fire, of the same soldiers seen at 3 separate sites days apart. They fear Adrian Ravaz the way old species feared myth." "They fear a ghost," Threx growled. "No," Hellman corrected. "They fear the possibility that the Imperium is no longer absolute." Ravaz stood over a projection scrawled in ash and rusted wire on a tunnel wall. His right leg now wore the exobrace of a downed Aelari scout, jury-rigged to respond to muscle pulses. His arm was gone, but the stump had fused over metal plating. His body was failing, but his mind burned brighter. "They can't track us when we move through the geothermal veins. Their sensors are blind inside the heat columns. We collapse the 12th bore tunnel behind us, lure them in. Once inside, we vent the thermal pressure and drown them in molten rock." Captain Salen frowned. "That's suicide." "It's war," Ravaz answered. "They believe we value life the way they do, that we're defined by avoidance of pain. They don't understand that pain is the only thing some of us have left to give." He looked across the gathered Ashborn. Half of them couldn't stand fully. All of them stared with the gaze of the resolved. "This isn't about killing them anymore. It's about making them realize we won't stop, not when our bodies break, not when our command falls, not when the earth itself turns against us. They have to see us walking through fire, crawling through their machines, bleeding and grinning, until they look at humanity and see not flesh but fury." Operation Prism Veil was meant to finish the rebellion. The Aelari landed a Terra burner, a world scorcher machine that would boil the atmosphere in a controlled radius, sterilizing all carbon-based life. It required 30 minutes to charge. They deployed it under elite guard in the plains north of the Severance Ridge. The Ashborn had 15 minutes to reach it. Ravaz didn't run, he walked. His brace sparked, his breath whistled through torn lungs. He had injected himself with a metabolic override that would kill him in under an hour, but would keep him moving for 45 minutes. Salen and 2 Ashborn moved beside him, 10 others spread outward. No communication, no drones, only intent. The plains lit up with tracer fire. Ravaz went straight through it. He took a hit in the leg, the brace locked. He dragged it forward anyway. Salen threw a spear made from repurposed conduit into a drone's intake vent, causing it to explode midair. Ravaz vaulted the resulting crater. An Aelari elite appeared before him, glimmering in battle armor, its plasma scythe rising. Ravaz didn't stop. He tackled the creature, took the blade through his side, and drove a thermal charge into its chest. It ignited a microflare. The scream of metal was louder than any voice. The charge time dropped to 10 minutes. Ravaz clawed his way up the base of the Terra burner. Every breath came wet. He reached the control node and began tearing wires with his teeth. The Imperium never planned for sabotage that required suicidal proximity. He overrode the alignment gyros and redirected the blast vector straight into the atmosphere. Then he triggered the ignition manually. In orbit, Aelari command screens turned white. The Terra burner misfired. The blast vented into the upper stratosphere, creating a feedback loop that burned out a third of the Imperium's orbital sensors. Their fleet staggered, blind and deaf for 4 minutes. Enough time for every Ashborn cell to strike. They surged from the tunnels, targeting ammo depots and power cores, not troops. They didn't fight to win, they fought to destroy infrastructure. By the time Aelari systems rebooted, 36 key facilities were vaporized or buried. And at the center of the scorched plain, Adrian Ravaz's body lay fused to the ruined Terra burner, one hand still clutched around the final override coil. A beacon pulsed from his chest, coded in human broadcast frequencies. It said only this: "We are still coming." High Castellan Threx stood in the remains of Command Spire 4, smoke curling from shattered terminals. His elite guard was dead, his leg was gone, tourniqueted in haste. Hellman knelt beside a damaged comms unit. "We underestimated them," Hellman said. "No, we misunderstood them," Threx turned slowly. "They aren't creatures of logic, they are not governed by strategy or instinct, they are governed by something we don't possess." Hellman's voice was a whisper. "They choose to suffer." Threx nodded. "And they choose to rise again, on broken limbs, with broken tools. They rise and they make us watch." 6 standard weeks after the Terra burner detonation, the Aelari fleet entered a state of enforced silence. All external broadcasts were sealed. All civilian transports rerouted from Aelari Prime's orbit. On 1,000 command decks across the sector, officers were ordered to purge visual logs and cease discussing the incident. The Imperium was hemorrhaging stability, and the cracks were no longer along the front lines. They were inside the hierarchy. Adrian Ravaz had become a name that no one could speak aloud without consequence. He had died, and in doing so, he had become a presence no weapon could eliminate. Reports of Ashborn echoes continued. Resistance forces had tripled in size, drawing from collapsed colonies and forgotten garrisons. Each new fighter claimed descent from the legacy of the broken soldier. They didn't need a leader anymore. They had witnessed him. In the devastated underbelly of Caridin's eastern orbit, among the remains of a shattered orbital refinery, a makeshift transmitter flared to life. The signal was jagged, constructed from repurposed alien frequencies. A voice broke through, filtered by static and distance. "This is Commander Uriatal of the Unified Mars Reclamation Detachment. We've received your beacon." The tunnel dwellers of Caridin froze. In the command vault of the last functioning resistance node, Captain Salen stared at the crackling console. "We thought," he swallowed, "we thought Earth was gone." "Earth stands," the voice replied, "and you are not alone." For the first time in months, the Ashborn wept. The Imperium began to panic behind locked doors. Aelari fleetmasters sent encrypted dispatches requesting psychological reinforcements. Scribes who charted historical military doctrine flagged a warning not issued in 2,000 years. The pattern has failed. What they had thought a containment issue, primitive defiance on a backwater world, was evolving into something virulent. Humanity, fractured and distant, was converging. And they were not returning to reclaim what was lost, they were coming to change the nature of war itself. In the debris of the gas giant Iskar VI, a Terran stealth carrier known as Veilbreaker emerged from occultation. It bore no insignia. Its hull was scarred and matte, designed to absorb light and memory. On its bridge stood Admiral Leon Khan, late of the Pacifican Space Forces, once thought lost during the siege of Io. His eyes flicked across the decoded data from Caridon. He walked on a broken leg for 6 kilometers, he murmured, carried the fuse core in his teeth. Yes, sir, replied his signal tech. The thermal signature matched a human biometric until the moment of ignition. No chain of command, no fleet overhead, just one man and the belief that he had not yet finished. Khan nodded, then let's show them what happens when that belief spreads. He keyed a command. Across 10 stealth ships cloaked in magnetic shadow, Terran strike teams began to deploy. They didn't aim for battles, they aimed for myths. Caridon's orbit cracked open as a dozen new blips pierced the atmosphere, too small for drop carriers, too fast for orbital debris. Aelari anti-air guns opened fire. 2 were immediately destroyed. The rest twisted midair, deploying metamaterial veins that altered their descent. They moved like falling knives. The Ashborn watched from below as the black darts slammed into no man's land and burst open, unfolding Terran special operatives wrapped in reactive cloaks, bristling with gear forged in hidden forges far from any known system. Commander Ariatal landed first, her face unreadable beneath a fractured helmet. Who's the senior among you? Captain Salen stepped forward, gun slung across his chest, features gaunt but steady. Ravaz, she said quietly, he was real. Salen nodded, he was more than that. Then we carry it forward, no chain of command, no nation, no flag. She handed him a shard of carbon steel, engraved with a single mark, a jagged flame. The signal has spread, there are revases now on 6 worlds. The Imperium doesn't see us as humans anymore, they see us as contagion. In the Tower of Symmetries, deep within the Aelari core systems, the Circle of Doctrine convened for the first time in 800 cycles. These were not warlords. These were the engineers of thought, those who had designed the very frameworks that governed Aelari warfare, diplomacy, and society. One of them, Mathomancer Ulvin, spoke what none wanted to admit. We cannot predict them, not anymore. Their actions break all known models. Ravaz was the inflection point. They have shifted from civilization to phenomenon. What are you saying? A senior doctrinalist demanded. I'm saying that we cannot defeat them with war, because what they are fighting with is not war. Silence. They fight with meaning, and meaning cannot be bombarded. In the ghost city of Old Terracas, now a half-collapsed ruin threaded with fungal lights and scavenger birds, the Ashborn built a shrine. Not to Ravaz, but to every fighter who carried the war beyond breaking. Mothers carried their children there to show them the melted coil he had held when he lit the skies. The Imperium deployed chemical agents in retaliation. Ashborn chemists created antidotes from lichen grown in reactor chambers. Aelari Command dropped viral scrubbers. Ashborn hacked them to deliver immune boosters. The harder the galaxy tried to erase them, the more impossible they became. In a forgotten hangar deep beneath Caridon's southern pole, a message played for the 1000th time, a recorded vidlog barely functioning. Ravaz, slumped and shaking, stared into a cracked lens. His voice was hoarse, soaked with blood. If you're hearing this, you're still breathing. Good, that's all you need. Everything else you take, piece by piece, brick by brick, you make them watch, not because it hurts, because they think we can't. And when they see you stand, when they see you walk on limbs that should have quit, they learn what we are. His eyes locked into the lens. We're the end of their doctrine, not the end of their lives, the end of their assumptions. They thought flesh meant weakness. So now we show them what broken flesh can do. On 10 worlds, resistance bloomed. Not in cities, not on maps, in caves, in wreckage, in the silence before an ambush. Children chanted the story of the soldier who would not fall. Elders passed down the tale of the limb-shattered warrior who dragged victory from the ground with his teeth. And the Aelari, with all their ships, with all their laws, with all their ancient control, could no longer sleep in peace. They had seen what came next. The war moved off Caridon Prime, it had to. The Aelari could no longer contain the infection. What began as a planetary insurgency had become a psychic rupture in the heart of the Imperium. Ravaz's last breath had not been a defeat, it had been a signal, and from that moment on, the galaxy itself began to shift. The Ashborn were no longer merely survivors.
They were seeds.
On the twilight colony of Naristau, long since bent under the Imperium's tithe system, miners rose from the deep gas caverns with explosives lashed to their backs. They detonated the command spires of Overseer Prime using thermite and ferrosteel chains. Their bodies had been worn down by gravity 12 times Terran norm, but they moved like ghosts through the vents, whispering a single name as they passed.
Rivaz.
On the orbital rings of Delphin Reach, a detachment of Aelari shock troopers attempted to reclaim a lost observatory. They found only corpses, Aelari corpses, each marked with Terran sigils, with the words "Walk Through Fire" scrawled in their own blood above the airlock doors. The Rivaz doctrine, though no Terran strategist had formalized it, became gospel among the rising human enclaves.
No fixed formations. No central command. No mercy for machinery. Every defeat is training. Every scar is instruction.
Every breath is war. And from the black reaches of unclaimed space came the others, forgotten colonies, lost ships, exiled nations. They heard the signal and came not with fleets but with fury. Admiral Leon Khan stood aboard the bridge of the Veilbreaker, now rechristened Ashborn Actual. He gazed out across a projection of the Antares Belt, where Aelari outposts flickered and pulsed. "We've confirmed Ashborn emergence on Targus 6, Miro Station and the Calixan clusters," reported Commander Tal. "They're not coordinating by FTL or burst comm, they're coordinating by pattern mimicry, doctrine transmission through behavior." Khan turned slowly. "You're telling me they're adapting Rivaz's tactics without even knowing who he was?"
"They feel him," Tal said. "They feel what he became, and it tells them how to fight."
A low hum filled the command bridge. The Terran-born strategists, once divided by borders, corporations, and blood feuds, were now united under a single truth. The war wasn't just winnable.
It had become necessary.
In the depths of the Aelari core spire on Maskell Prime, the Primarch of Strategic Continuity, Siln Ixer Ra, reviewed the unthinkable. 27 planetary engagements, said his subordinate. 24 losses, 3 undecided, not due to firepower, not due to strategic parity, due to psychological collapse among our own ranks.
"Show me the latest incident," Siln ordered.
A recording played. An Aelari detachment landed on what they believed to be a derelict human mining site. They entered a tunnel. Heat signatures indicated only residual carbon. But then the walls themselves erupted. Humans emerged, half-camouflaged in ash, their limbs wrapped in composite plating. One woman ignited her own oxygen pack as a makeshift thermobaric charge. Another used her broken fingers to push a detonator into a commander's thorax.
The screen darkened.
"They do not retreat," Siln whispered, "even when they cannot win." "They do not care if they win, Primarch," said the subordinate. "They care only that we bleed." On the surface of Miro Station, the first Terran carrier group to re-enter galactic battle space landed under a banner of scorched crimson. The Aelari attacked immediately. But this time the humans did not hide. This time they marched forward with full knowledge that they would be outnumbered, outgunned, outmaneuvered. Because now it wasn't about victory, it was about demonstration. An Ashborn commando with no legs mounted a kinetic launcher and fired it from his prone position into an Aelari fusion core. A team of medics charged into fire unarmed, planting virus spores into Aelari supply caches, knowing they would die before extraction. And the Aelari retreated, not because they had to, but because something ancient twisted in their chests, something they had not felt since the age before the Imperium. Doubt. In the Terran Deep Black Network, a message cycled without origin. "They broke our skies, they took our limbs, they burned our cities, but they could not burn the will to stand again. We are not a race, we are a resurgence, we are the ones who rise, and the galaxy will come to know this. You can shatter the flesh, but you cannot stop the step." Across 50 systems it appeared and vanished. Across 5 enemy networks it echoed in fragments. Aelari scouts tried to trace it, they failed. Aelari philosophers tried to dismiss it, they couldn't. And the fleetmasters began issuing orders none had expected to hear. Withdraw. In the shattered ruins of the old Aelari citadel on Naristau, a summit formed, not political, not hierarchical, just present. Ashborn leaders, Terran admirals, colony firebrands, they gathered in a dome with no roof open to stars in the black sky. There was no anthem, no declaration.
Just the question.
What now? Admiral Khan looked toward Commander Tal.
She answered without hesitation.
Now we take what they said we couldn't have. Now we walk into their order and set it on fire, not to conquer, not to own, but to show the galaxy what it means to endure without permission.
Another voice spoke ragged but fierce, a survivor from Caridon. We don't need to rule them, we just need them to understand. Flesh was never weakness, flesh is what keeps moving. And slowly from across the chamber came the whisper like steel dragged through fire.
We carry the war.
In the vacuum above the lost moon of Tyr, where no transmissions could reach, a single Aelari cruiser found itself intercepted. Not by ships, by beacons, hundreds of them drifting, each one bearing the symbol of the Ashborn. The cruiser opened fire, but there was nothing to hit. Just echoes. Just warnings. Just presence. They fled the sector, and for the first time in Imperium history, the retreat was logged not as strategic repositioning, but as flight. The Ravaz doctrine had no text. It had no page, no code, no strategy simulation. It lived only in the acts of the defiant. A human with one lung storming a relay node. A youth with no name lobbing energy cells at gunships. A squad of orphans setting off a detonation to bury themselves beneath an Aelari garrison, smiling as the ceiling came down. There were no medals, there were no statues. There was only the step. The step after the wound. The step after the loss. The step no empire could prepare for. Far from the war in the deepest vault of Aelari history, a keeper unsealed an ancient record once buried beneath layers of doctrine. It described a time when the Aelari were not yet the Imperium, a time when they were hunted, fragmented, uncertain, when they fought not to conquer but to survive. He read in silence, then closed the vault. And for the first time in his long life, he wondered. Had they just met the force that would return them to that forgotten truth? It began with the collapse of the Aelari enclave on Suresh Delta. Not a battlefield, not a tactical target, a cultural vault where knowledge of the Imperium's history was preserved in living neural crystal. There were no weapons stationed there, no defenses. It had stood unmolested for 20,000 cycles. It was not destroyed with explosives. It was emptied. The knowledge, the memories, the ancestral truths gone, rewritten. The neural crystal had been reprogrammed to repeat one phrase across every node, every thought echo. Flesh remembers, flesh adapts, flesh endures. The Aelari called an emergency summit across all sectors. The Ashborn didn't wait for the outcome. They struck the same night. Across the galactic plane, the war changed shape again. Terran resistance no longer fought to reclaim earthbound territory or to liberate systems of old. They fought to erase the very concept of inevitability. The Ashborn had learned that fear was not enough. The Imperium had to doubt itself, not just its victories but the principles behind them. On Zorinthket, an orbital cathedral of Aelari law was melted from within by Ashborn sleeper agents. The law data was twisted, rewritten mid-broadcast to transmit human philosophical paradoxes, illogical affirmations of agency and will. The Aelari speakers collapsed on the floor, minds unable to parse what had no fixed structure. On the burning rim world of Jesse, Terran engineers dismantled an Imperium terraforming array, then used its planetary core lens to fire a pulse into orbit, not at enemy ships but into deep space, aimed precisely at a Blacksate Aelari archive over 4 sectors away. A shot no one knew was possible from a platform not designed to kill. The archive cracked. The galaxy blinked. And the Aelari were no longer sure if humans followed any rules at all. Primarch Siln Ixer Ra called for a complete doctrinal collapse review. What does that mean? Demanded a senior tactician. It means we are preparing to dismantle the system we've used to rule the galaxy, because that system is broken. He turned to the Chamber of Minds, war philosophers, code shapers, biocommanders. We assumed they were animals wielding tools, then we assumed they were thinkers without vision, now we see them as something worse. He paused. They are not bound by victory, they are not seeking status, they are not here to replace us, they are reforging reality through suffering. One of the youngest minds in the room spoke softly, then what can we do? The chamber was silent for a long time. We must change, Siln said, or die still trying to understand them. The humans never called it peace. They did not sign treaties, no embassies were raised, no flags planted. What came after the fire was presence. Ashborn enclaves existed on once Imperium worlds, not as rulers but as memory. They sat in burned-out halls, teaching the story of what had been done and why it must never be done again. Children were taught not the tactics of war, but the moment Rivaz stood, not to kill but to continue. It was a doctrine of the broken, not the victorious. On Caridin Prime, now called Kara's End, a single human structure remained above the earth, a monolith of fused steel and scorched stone. At its center, beneath open sky, a sculpture stood. Not Rivaz, but a dozen humans, scarred, wounded, standing together, arms linked, every limb imperfect, every face damaged. A ring of Aelari stone surrounded it, carved with symbols of change. Not submission. Understanding. In the far systems, Aelari scouts returned from exile to their birthworlds. Some came not with soldiers but with questions. They entered Ashborn zones and sat among Terrans not as invaders but as learners. They listened to stories of the siege, of the fires, of the walk through blood and ruin. And slowly a new term emerged, one never used before in Aelari history. Witness state. A condition of awareness that came only through watching something unexplainable survive against reason, a reverence not for dominance but for endurance. Aelari children began painting their skin with charcoal streaks in the Terran style, not to mimic the humans, but to remind themselves of what their species had forgotten. That logic without empathy becomes tyranny. That order without struggle becomes rot. That power without cost becomes blind. And deep within the void, in the last place no one had touched, where the signal of Rivaz had first died and first risen, a light pulsed again. Not a message. Not a code. Just a flickering echo of life. Human. One arm, one leg rebuilt from Aelari steel, the body scorched, half-mechanical, fused with forgotten tech, eyes dull but open. Heartbeat. Weak, but steady. No name, no identification, just a scan pulse that triggered a final message across old Terran channels. I saw the edge, I walked past it, and there was more. The file was signed with one character burned into the signal's metadata. The Imperium did not end. But it bent. It began to reshape. Aelari no longer referred to Terrans as primitives. The new lexicon spoke of the unyielding, a species born from contradiction, one whose great weapon was not innovation or aggression, but the refusal to stay down, the refusal to be quiet, the refusal to obey physics, strategy, or death itself. And in the darkest corners of the galaxy, where new threats stirred, where forgotten monsters blinked and ancient voids whispered once more, stories spread not of weapons or ships or fleets, but of a soldier who walked into the fire on broken limbs, and never stopped walking.